My wife filed for divorce the day she graduated from law school. I said nothing and signed the papers. I packed up my entire life and vanished without a trace. She laughed when I left, but she never imagined I would never come back. After 4 long years, she found me, along with those 420 missed calls. You know that feeling when you're watching a movie and the protagonist is about to make the stupidest decision of his life, and you're sitting there thinking, "Don't do it, you moron." Yeah, well, turns out life doesn't come with director's commentary, and I was the idiot walking straight into the buzzsaw. The call came at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that felt like it had been dragged through broken glass. Sienna's voice cut through my phone speaker with the precision of a surgical blade. All business, no warmth. "Grant, meet me in the law school parking lot. 20 minutes. Click. No goodbye, no explanation, just the digital equivalent of a judge's gavel falling. I should have known something was off. In our 3 years of marriage, Sienna had never asked me to meet her anywhere on campus. Hell, she barely acknowledged my existence when we bumped into her classmates at the grocery store. I was the guy who fixed things. HVAC units, broken faucets, her Tesla's charging port when it decided to have an attitude. Blue-collar Grant, good with his hands, not so hot with the legal jargon that flowed through our Upper West Side apartment like expensive wine at a shareholder meeting. But there I was, 20 minutes later, pulling my beat-up Ford F-150 into the pristine parking lot of Columbia Law School, feeling like a rust stain on a Tom Ford suit. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, surrounded by future lawyers who'd probably spend their careers in glass towers making more in a month than I'd see in a year, and I was about to get served papers by my own wife. Sienna stood near the entrance, still wearing her graduation cap and gown. The late afternoon sun caught the gold tassel, making it shimmer like the promise of a series of funding round. She looked every inch the brilliant attorney she'd worked her ass off to become, valedictorian, law review editor, the whole 9 yards. Even from 50 feet away, I could see the confidence radiating off her like heat from asphalt. She didn't wave, didn't smile, just started walking toward my truck with the determined stride of someone about to execute a hostile takeover. I killed the engine and climbed out, my work boots hitting the pavement with a sound that seemed too loud in the academic quiet. My hands were still dirty from the morning job, replacing brake pads on a delivery truck for some startup that burned through venture capital like it was Halloween candy. The contrast between us had never felt more obvious. "Congratulations," I said, nodding toward her cap. "JD looks good on you." She didn't thank me. Instead, she reached into her gown and pulled out a manila envelope, thick as a small novel. "Sign these." Just like that. No preamble. No, we need to talk. No acknowledgement of the 3 years we'd supposedly shared. She placed the envelope on my tailgate like she was serving a subpoena to a deadbeat CEO. I didn't need to open it. The weight, the formality, the way she stood there like a prosecutor waiting for a plea, it all added up to one conclusion. Divorce papers. Funny how life's biggest moments can fit into such ordinary packaging. "You want to tell me what brought this on?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. It had been building for months. The late nights at the law library, the hushed phone calls, the way she'd started talking about her future like it was a solo act. "Does it matter?" She crossed her arms, and for a second, I caught a glimpse of the woman I'd fallen for. Sharp, uncompromising, brilliant as hell. "We both know this isn't working." She was right, of course. Our marriage had been running on fumes for the better part of a year, ever since she'd landed that summer associate position at some white shoe firm downtown. I'd watch her leave in the morning, all pressed suits and ambition, while I grabbed my tool belt and headed off to fix someone else's problems. By the time she came home, we were speaking different languages, hers full of torts and litigation strategies, mine limited to "How was your day?" and "What's for dinner?" I opened the envelope and flipped through the pages. Standard no-fault divorce, clean as a whistle. She wasn't asking for alimony, wasn't going after my truck or my tools. Hell, she was even letting me keep the security deposit on our apartment, though I noticed she'd already found herself a new place, some swanky address that probably came with a doorman and marble countertops. "You've got this all figured out," I said, scanning the property division. "When did you file?" "Last week." She glanced at her phone, checking the time like she had somewhere important to be, which, knowing Sienna, she probably did. My attorney says we can have everything finalized within 60 days if you don't contest. Her attorney, not our attorney, not someone we'd consulted together. Her attorney, probably some partner at the firm where she'd been interning, someone who wore $1,000 watches and knew the difference between a Series B and a mezzanine round. I found a pen in my glove compartment, a cheap Bic that had seen better days, not exactly the Mont Blanc you'd expect for signing your life away. But hell, it worked, and that's all that mattered. You know, I said, clicking the pen open, most people at least pretend to be sad about this part. For the first time since she'd walked over, something flickered across her face. Maybe regret, maybe just impatience. Would it make a difference? I thought about that for a second. Would it? Would some tears, some hand-wringing about how hard this was, change the fact that she'd already checked out? That she'd been planning this exit strategy while I was still trying to figure out how to make us work? Nah, I said, and signed my name on the dotted line. Guess it wouldn't. She took the papers back, folded them neatly, and tucked them into her purse, a designer number that probably cost more than my truck payment. I'll have my things out of the apartment by Friday. Take your time, I said, though we both knew she wouldn't need it. Sienna was the type who could pack up a life as efficiently as she'd dissected a case study. She turned to go, then stopped. Grant, this isn't personal. I almost laughed at that. Divorce is pretty much the definition of personal, Sienna. You know what I mean. She adjusted her graduation cap, and for a moment, she looked young again. Like the girl I'd met at that bar near campus 3 years ago, the one who'd been impressed that I could fix her laptop with nothing but a screwdriver and some patience. You're a good man. You deserve someone who what? Who doesn't want more than a guy with dirty fingernails and a high school diploma? She flinched at that, and I immediately regretted the words. This wasn't her fault, not really. She'd never lied about her ambitions, never pretended that love would be enough to bridge the gap between her corner office dreams and my blue-collar reality. I'm sorry, she said, and I think she actually meant it. I watched her walk back across the parking lot, her heels clicking against the asphalt with the confidence of someone who'd just executed a perfect acquisition strategy. She didn't look back, didn't wave, just disappeared through the law school's glass doors like she was entering a different world, which, I guess, she was. I sat in my truck for a long time after that, engine off, windows down, listening to the sounds of a campus winding down for the day. Students walked past, laughing and planning their futures, and I felt about 100 years old. My phone buzzed. Diego, probably wondering where I was. We had a job tomorrow morning, moving some tech startup servers to a new data center. Life, as they say, goes on. But as I finally started the engine and pulled out of that parking lot, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was driving away from more than just a marriage. I was leaving behind the last piece of the life I'd tried to build, the last connection to the man I'd thought I could become. The road stretched out ahead of me, empty and uncertain, and for the first time in years, I had absolutely no idea where I was going. Turns out, sometimes that's exactly where you need to be. You ever notice how the universe has this twisted sense of timing? Like how your car breaks down the day before payday, or how you find out your wife's been planning to dump you exactly 24 hours after you've done her a favor that makes you look like the world's biggest chump. Yeah, that's exactly the kind of cosmic joke I walked into the night before Sienna's graduation. It started innocently enough. Well, as innocent as anything gets when you're married to someone who's been treating you like a subcontractor for the better part of 6 months. Sienna had mentioned that her brake light was acting up, and being the dutiful husband with more tools than sense, I'd volunteered to fix it. Because that's what I did, I fixed things. Air conditioners, leaky pipes, relationships that were already circling the drain. Some problems just can't be solved with a wrench and some electrical tape. But hey, I was a slow learner. The Tesla Model S sat in our building's parking garage like a sleek shark among minnows. 60 grand worth of German engineering and Silicon Valley swagger, financed through some legal tech startup's equipment leasing program that Sienna had explained to me once using words like depreciation schedules and tax optimization. I nodded along like I understood, the same way I nodded when she talked about her internship at Marlowe and Winslow LLP, the white shoe firm that had been courting her since her second year. I popped the hood and got to work, my hands moving through the familiar routine of diagnosing and fixing. The brake light issue turned out to be a loose connection, 5 minutes with a screwdriver, maybe $10 in parts. Simple fix for a simple problem, which should have been my first clue that nothing about that night was going to stay simple. That's when I heard the phone buzz. It was sitting on the passenger seat, face up, the screen lighting up like a beacon in the garage's dim lighting. Sienna's iPhone. The latest model, of course, because image matters when you're networking with partners who bill out at $800 an hour. She'd left it behind when she'd gone upstairs to grab some case files, muttering something about a study group and late-night prep for tomorrow's ceremony. The buzz came again, then again. Someone was calling, and whoever it was, they were persistent as hell. The phone was connected to the car's Bluetooth system, and before I could figure out how to disconnect it, the call went to voicemail and started playing through the Tesla's premium sound system. Sienna, it's Trent. Hope you're ready for tomorrow. You've earned this moment, and I couldn't be prouder of my brightest associate. Trent Marlowe, senior partner at Marlowe and Winslow, the guy whose name was on the letterhead and whose corner office probably had a better view than most people's apartments. I'd met him exactly once, at some firm holiday party where I'd spent the evening nursing a beer and watching lawyers network like it was an Olympic sport. Smooth as aged Macallan 25, with the kind of confidence that comes from closing deals worth more than most people see in a lifetime. The message continued, and Trent's voice dropped to something more intimate, more personal. I know tomorrow's going to be hectic with family and all that, but I wanted you to know that your future here is as bright as we discussed. The partnership track is wide open for someone with your talents. There was a pause, the kind of loaded silence that speaks volumes, and then Trent's voice came back with a chuckle that made my stomach turn. I assume you've got everything handled with the domestic situation? The papers we discussed? Because honestly, Sienna, a woman of your caliber shouldn't be held back by stepping stones. Stepping stones. That's what I was. 3 years of marriage. 3 years of supporting her through law school. 3 years of pretending I didn't notice how she'd started talking about when I'm a lawyer instead of when we're settled. All of it reduced to a stepping stone, something to be used, and then left behind when it was no longer convenient. The message kept going, Trent's voice painting pictures of signing bonuses and equity partnerships, of a life where Sienna could finally reach her potential without the dead weight of a husband who fixed air conditioners for a living. He talked about the firm's expansion plans, their new venture capital practice, the opportunities for someone smart enough to position herself correctly. Anyway, Trent concluded, his voice back to professional smoothness. Congratulations again, counselor. See you at the ceremony tomorrow, and then we can start planning your real future. Oh, and Sienna, don't worry about the transition. These things are always easier when everyone's on the same page. The message ended, and the car fell silent except for the hum of the parking garage's ventilation system. I sat there in the driver's seat, my tools scattered around me, processing what I'd just heard. It wasn't anger that hit me first, it was clarity. Pure, crystalline clarity about exactly what had been happening in my marriage while I'd been too busy trying to be supportive to notice the hostile takeover in progress. Sienna hadn't just decided to divorce me on a whim. This was a calculated business decision, planned and executed with the same precision she'd bring to a corporate restructuring. The papers she'd have ready tomorrow, the clean property division, the seamless transition, it was all part of a compliance strategy designed to minimize disruption to her career trajectory. I pulled out my phone and replayed the message, this time recording it with a cheap app I'd downloaded months ago for work. Sometimes you need audio records when contractors try to change the terms of a deal mid-project and old habits die hard. The recording was crystal clear, Trent's voice, his words, the timeline that proved this wasn't some spur-of-the-moment decision. When I was done, I transferred the file to a thumb drive I kept in my toolbox, one of those generic flash drives you can buy at any electronics store for $10. Nothing fancy, nothing traceable, just digital insurance in case I ever needed to remember exactly how this had all gone down. I tucked it under the back seat with my tire iron, wedged between the foam padding and the metal frame where it would stay safe and forgotten until I decided what to do with it. The funny thing was, the recording didn't make me angry. It should have. Finding out your wife's boss had been coaching her through your divorce, discovering that your marriage had been nothing more than a line item on someone else's business plan. But instead of rage, I felt something else entirely, relief. For months, I'd been trying to figure out what I'd done wrong, how I could fix things between us, what I needed to change to make Sienna happy. Turns out, The problem wasn't anything I'd done or failed to do. The problem was that I existed, that I was an inconvenient reminder of a life she'd outgrown, a stepping stone that had served its purpose and now needed to be discarded. I finished the brake light repair in silence, my hands steady despite the earthquake happening inside my head. When Sienna came back down to the garage 20 minutes later, files in hand, and that distracted look she wore when she was thinking about legal strategies, I was closing the hood and packing up my tools. "All fixed?" she asked, not really looking at me. "Yeah," I said, wiping my hands on an old rag. "Good as new." She smiled, the first genuine smile she'd given me in weeks, and for a moment, I saw the girl I'd fallen in love with. Then her phone buzzed again, and the mask slipped back into place. "Thanks, Grant. I don't know what I'd do without you." 24 hours later, I'd find out exactly what she planned to do without me. But that night, I just nodded and followed her upstairs, the weight of the truth sitting in my chest like a stone. Some knowledge changes everything, and some secrets are heavier than the lies they replace. I had 18 hours until graduation. 18 hours to decide what kind of man I wanted to be when my marriage officially ended and my real life finally began. There's an art to disappearing, and most people get it completely wrong. They think it's about dramatic exits and burning bridges, about leaving manifestos and making statements. But real vanishing, the kind that sticks, is about becoming so unremarkable that people forget you were ever there in the first place. It's about turning yourself into white noise, background static, the kind of person who blends into the machinery of everyday life until you're practically invisible. I learned that the hard way at 2:17 a.m. on a Wednesday that felt like the end of the world. After Sienna handed me those divorce papers, after I'd driven around the city for 3 hours trying to process what my life had just become, I ended up back at our apartment. Correction, her apartment now, sitting in my truck in the parking garage like some kind of stalker. The building we'd called home for 2 years suddenly looked different, like I was seeing it through the wrong end of a telescope. All those windows, all those people living their normal lives while mine imploded in real time. The smart play would have been to go upstairs, pour myself 3 fingers of something strong, and figure out my next move over the course of a few days. Maybe lawyer up, contest the divorce, make things complicated out of spite. But spite requires energy I didn't have, and besides, Trent Marlowe's voice kept echoing in my head. Stepping stones don't fight back, they just get stepped on. So I made a different choice. I decided to evaporate. The apartment was dark when I let myself in. Sienna already gone to whatever celebration dinner her law school friends had organized. Perfect. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, taking inventory of a life I was about to abandon. 3 years of shared existence, and it was amazing how little of it actually belonged to me. The furniture was hers, purchased with money from her summer associate positions, chosen to match the aesthetic of someone climbing the corporate ladder. The artwork, the kitchen gadgets that cost more than my monthly truck payment, the bottle of Dom Perignon she'd been saving for her first big case win. All hers. I was just the guy who'd helped carry it all upstairs. My stuff fit into 2 garbage bags and a duffel that had seen me through 2 tours in Afghanistan. Work clothes, mostly jeans and flannel shirts that smelled like motor oil and honest sweat. A few books, none of them legal texts. Some tools that were too good to leave behind, including the socket set my dad had given me when I got out of the Marines. Personal items that told the story of a man who fixed things with his hands and didn't apologize for it. I left my phone on the kitchen counter, screen down like a digital headstone. That little device contained 3 years of shared history. Texts from Sienna about grocery lists and dinner plans, photos from happier times, contact information for a life I was walking away from. But phones are tracking devices disguised as conveniences, and where I was going, I needed to be unreachable. The cloud accounts were next. Google, Apple, Microsoft, I wiped them all, deleted years of digital breadcrumbs with the systematic efficiency of someone erasing their own existence. Email accounts got closed, social media profiles disappeared, even the Netflix subscription got canceled. In the modern world, you exist in servers and databases as much as you do in flesh and blood, and I was determined to be a ghost in both realms. I left an envelope with next month's rent in cash on the kitchen table, along with the key to the apartment and a note that said simply, "Paid through October. Good luck." No explanations, No forwarding address. No dramatic speeches about betrayal and broken trust. Just a clean exit, professional as a corporate restructuring. The bus station at 4 a.m. is a special kind of purgatory, fluorescent lit and smelling of industrial disinfectant, populated by people who've made choices that led them to places they never intended to go. I bought a ticket with cash to a city I'd never been to, chosen almost at random from the departures board. Greywater. Population 47,000, according to the faded brochure in the waiting area. A port town 6 hours south. The kind of place that existed to serve the machinery of commerce without drawing attention to itself. The bus was half empty, filled with shift workers and people running from something. Maybe the law, maybe their families, maybe just the accumulated weight of their own mistakes. I sat in the back, watched the city shrink in the rear window, and felt something like peace settle over me for the first time in months. There's freedom in having nothing left to lose, a clarity that comes from burning your bridges so thoroughly that retreat isn't an option. Greywater looked exactly like what it was, a working port that had seen better decades but refused to die. The air tasted of salt and diesel fuel, thick with the smell of honest industry. Fishing boats and cargo vessels shared the harbor with oil tankers and container ships, a 24-hour economy that ran on caffeine and overtime pay. It was the kind of place where a man could disappear into the background noise of commerce, become just another pair of hands willing to work for fair wages. I found a room above Chin's bait shop for $200 a week, cash in advance. Mr. Liang, the owner, was a widower in his 70s who'd been running the business since the Carter administration. He asked 3 questions. You drink too much? No. You bring trouble? No. You pay on time? Yes. That was the extent of my background check. The room was about what you'd expect for $200 a week. A bed, a chair, a hot plate, and a window that looked out over the harbor. Spartan as a Marine barracks, which suited me fine. I'd lived with less in places where people actively tried to kill me, so a clean room with running water felt like luxury. Within a week, I had work. The docks were always short-handed, and a guy with a strong back and basic mechanical skills could find employment without too many questions about his past. Day shifts loading containers, night shifts maintaining the cranes and forklifts that kept commerce moving. The work was hard, honest, and beautifully simple. No office politics, no strategic planning sessions, just the straightforward exchange of labor for wages. I kept my hair short, my answers shorter, and my name quieter. When people asked where I was from, I said back east and changed the subject. When they asked what brought me to Greywater, I said work and let them fill in their own stories. Most people weren't that curious anyway. Port towns are full of people reinventing themselves, and everyone understands the value of not asking too many questions. After 3 months, I could walk down Harbor Street without feeling like I was wearing someone else's skin. The other workers knew me as Grant, the quiet guy who showed up on time and didn't complain about overtime. The waitress at Murphy's Diner knew I liked my coffee black and my eggs over easy. Mr. Liang knew I was good for the rent and didn't leave messes in the common areas. That was enough. For the first time since Afghanistan, maybe the first time in my adult life, I wasn't trying to be someone else's version of who I should be. I was just Grant. No husband, no stepping stone, no disappointment in work boots. Just a man who fixed things and minded his own business in a city that understood the value of both. The old life felt like something that had happened to someone else, a story I'd heard secondhand about people I'd never met. And maybe that was the point. Sometimes the only way forward is to kill who you used to be and see what grows back in the empty space. You know what they don't teach you in business school? How to build something real when you're starting from absolutely nothing. When your credit history reads like a cautionary tale and your business plan fits on the back of a bar napkin. They teach you about venture capital and series of funding rounds, about pitch decks and market penetration strategies. But they don't teach you how to bootstrap a company with 3 guys, a borrowed truck, and enough collective stubbornness to power a small city. That's exactly what Diego Cruz and I did 2 years into my Greywater exile, and it started with a phone call I almost didn't answer. Diego had found me through the kind of network that doesn't show up on LinkedIn. The informal brotherhood of Marines who keep track of each other through bartenders, job foremen, and the occasional postcard from wherever the wind had blown them. He tracked me down to Murphy's Diner on a Tuesday morning when the fog was so thick you couldn't see the harbor from the window. Grant fucking Mercer, he said, sliding into the booth across from me like we'd planned to meet. You look like hell, brother. Diego looked exactly the same as he had 3 years ago, compact and dangerous, with the kind of smile that could charm information out of a federal prosecutor or talk his way out of a bar fight, depending on what the situation required. He'd always been the smart one in our unit, the guy who could look at a logistics problem and see solutions that weren't obvious to the rest of us grunts. "How'd you find me?" I asked, signaling the waitress for another coffee. "Tasha Okoye sends her regards," he said, and that explained everything. Tasha had been the dispatcher at the scrapyard where I'd worked my last month in the city, a sharp-eyed woman who noticed everything and forgot nothing. If anyone could track a man who'd tried to disappear, it would be her. "She also sends this," Diego continued, sliding a folded envelope across the table. Inside was $800 cash and a note in Tasha's neat handwriting. "For when you're ready to stop running and start building." Diego laid out his proposition over coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the Clinton administration. He'd been working construction in Baltimore, making decent money but going nowhere fast, when an opportunity had fallen into his lap. A legal services company needed someone to handle their after-hours logistics, moving files between offices, transporting evidence to courthouses, handling the kind of sensitive materials that required discretion and insurance bonds. "Thing is," Diego explained, "they need someone clean. No criminal record, military background preferred, someone who understands operational security. Problem is, all the established companies are booked solid or charge fees that would make a private equity firm blush." That's when he'd remembered me. Grant Mercer, the guy who could fix anything and keep his mouth shut while doing it. He'd pitched the idea to his contact at the legal services company, talked me up as a partner with maritime logistics experience and a clean background check. "So what's the catch?" I asked, because there's always a catch. "We need to be incorporated, insured, and operational in 30 days. We need equipment, drivers, and enough working capital to cover payroll for 3 months without a guaranteed revenue stream. In other words, we needed to build a legitimate business from scratch with no money, no credit, and no safety net." It sounded completely insane, which probably explained why it appealed to me. We called it Harborline Rig and Recovery, partly because it sounded professional and partly because Diego liked the acronym. Our business model was simple. We handled the jobs that established logistics companies wouldn't touch: midnight moves, sensitive cargo, anything that required flexibility and discretion over corporate infrastructure. Tasha Okoye became our unofficial talent scout, connected to a network of people who needed second chances and steady work. She introduced us to Boone Ox Turner, a veteran rigger who could move a piano up 3 flights of stairs without scratching the paint, but couldn't pass a traditional background check due to some youthful indiscretions involving military property and creative interpretations of ownership laws. Then there was Eli Novak, a forklift operator who'd been blacklisted from the major shipping companies after a workplace accident that wasn't his fault, but had cost his previous employer a fortune in insurance claims. Eli was methodical, careful, and desperate for work that would let him support his daughter's medical expenses. The business side fell to Anika Desai, an accountant who'd been referred to us by a mutual friend who owed Diego a favor from their Army days. Anika was everything I wasn't: organized, detail-oriented, and capable of navigating the labyrinth of corporate compliance requirements that would keep us legitimate. "First rule," she told us during our initial meeting at her cramped office above a tax preparation service, "is that we separate your personal assets from the company's liabilities. You don't want some litigation nightmare touching your personal finances." She set up a corporate structure that would have impressed the legal team at a Fortune 500 company. Limited liability entities, proper insurance coverage, employment contracts that protected both us and our workers. "Trusts, not trophies," became her motto, meaning that we focused on building sustainable systems rather than flashy displays of success. The first year was brutal. We worked 18-hour days, took jobs that paid barely above cost, and reinvested every dollar back into equipment and insurance. Our office was a converted warehouse space that smelled like motor oil and ambition, furnished with folding tables and secondhand filing cabinets that Ox had acquired from a company that was upgrading their office furniture. But slowly, methodically, we built something real. Word spread through the legal community that Harborline could handle sensitive moves without asking uncomfortable questions or charging premium rates. We moved files for law firms going through partnership disputes, transported evidence for cases that required absolute chain-of-custody documentation, handled office relocations for companies that needed to be operational again within hours rather than days. The breakthrough came when we landed a contract to move an entire server farm for a legal tech startup that was being acquired by a larger firm. The job required moving millions of dollars worth of equipment overnight, with zero downtime tolerance and insurance coverage that exceeded our annual revenue. It was exactly the kind of high-stakes operation that established companies would charge premium rates for, but we were hungry enough to bid competitively and professional enough to execute flawlessly. After that, the phone started ringing regularly. Not every day, not enough to make us rich, but enough to cover payroll, rent, and the gradual expansion of our capabilities. We added more trucks, hired additional drivers, invested in better equipment and training. By the end of our second year, we had 6 full-time employees, a fleet of specialized vehicles, and a reputation for reliability that was worth more than any advertising campaign. We still worked long hours and lived modestly, but there was a difference between struggling and building. One felt like survival, the other felt like progress. The coffee machine that didn't leak became my personal symbol of success. It was a small thing, a $50 appliance that most people wouldn't think twice about, but for me it represented the difference between making do and having enough to buy something that worked properly the first time. For the first time since Afghanistan, silence felt like safety rather than punishment. Not the silence of isolation, but the quiet confidence that comes from building something sustainable, something that could weather the storms that inevitably come for any small business operating in the margins of larger industries. We were still invisible, still working in the background while other companies got the spotlight, but that was exactly how we wanted it. Invisible meant stable, and stable meant we could plan for a future that extended beyond next week's payroll. Here's what they don't tell you about revenge in the movies. It's not about explosions and dramatic confrontations. Real revenge is an accounting problem. It's about understanding the difference between assets and liabilities, between leverage and exposure, between what people say they want and what they actually need to survive. And if you're patient enough to study the system, you'll find that every empire, no matter how impressive it looks from the outside, is held together by a surprisingly small number of very fragile threads. I learned that lesson 3 years into running Harborline, when our legitimate business started giving us access to information that most people never see. It began with a simple logistics contract, moving files for a malpractice insurance company that was conducting audits on several downtown law firms. Nothing glamorous, just boxes of case files and compliance documents that needed to be transported between offices under strict confidentiality agreements. But when you're handling that volume of sensitive material on a regular basis, you start to notice patterns. Law firms aren't just about courtroom drama and billable hours. They're complex financial organisms with all the same vulnerabilities as any other business: cash flow problems, insurance requirements, regulatory compliance issues, landlord-tenant relationships. Every aspect of their operations generates paperwork, and eventually, all that paperwork needs to be moved, stored, or destroyed by people like us. Diego was the first to suggest we pay attention to what we were seeing. Not snooping, not violating client confidentiality, but simply being observant about the broader patterns in the legal industry. When you're moving boxes of partnership agreements and insurance audits, you get a feel for which firms are thriving and which ones are scrambling to keep the lights on. Information is just another kind of asset, he told me one evening as we were inventorying equipment in our warehouse. And like any asset, it's only valuable if you know how to deploy it responsibly. That's when Noor Almazy entered our orbit. Noor was a freelance researcher who specialized in public records analysis, the kind of person who could find connections between seemingly unrelated pieces of information using nothing but courthouse databases and SEC filings. Diego had met her through a mutual friend in Baltimore, someone who'd vouched for both her discretion and her ability to turn raw data into actionable intelligence. Noor looked like she'd stepped out of a law school recruiting brochure: sharp suit, confident handshake, the kind of professional polish that opened doors in corporate environments. But she had the analytical mind of a forensic accountant and the moral flexibility of someone who'd learned to navigate gray areas without losing sleep. Every law firm is a small business. She explained during our first meeting at a coffee shop that specialized in fair trade beans and overpriced pastries. They have the same operational vulnerabilities as any other professional services firm. Dependency on key clients, cash flow cycles, partnership disputes, regulatory exposure. She pulled out a tablet and showed us a sample analysis she'd done on a mid-sized firm in Philadelphia. Public records revealed everything from their office lease terms to their malpractice insurance premiums, from partnership changes to client payment schedules. It was all legally available information, but assembled together it painted a detailed picture of the firm's financial health and operational vulnerabilities. The trick, Noor continued, is understanding which pressure points actually matter. Most firms can survive a bad quarter or lose a major client. But when multiple stresses hit simultaneously, that's when interesting things happen. We started with small experiments. When Harborline was hired to handle an office move for a firm going through internal restructuring, we'd researched the public background beforehand, not to exploit it, but to understand the context of what we were seeing. Partnership disputes, insurance audits, landlord negotiations, all of it became part of a broader education in how the legal industry actually functioned behind the scenes. The real breakthrough came when we decided to test whether we could play the game from the other side. Through a shell company Diego had incorporated in Delaware, Stonebridge North LLC, named after a street near the warehouse, we started making small investments in commercial real estate. Nothing dramatic, just quiet acquisitions of buildings that housed professional services firms. Our first purchase was a downtown office building that had been owned by a family trust for 30 years. The family was dealing with estate planning issues and wanted a quick, cash sale. Stonebridge North bought the building for $800,000, financed through a combination of Harborline's accumulated profits and a private loan from Leonard Pembroke, a former merchant banker who'd retired to Greywater to run a charter fishing business. Leonard was the kind of guy who'd spent 40 years structuring complex deals for Fortune 500 companies before deciding that life was too short to spend in conference rooms. He still had connections in the private lending market and an encyclopedic knowledge of commercial real estate financing. The beauty of owning the building, Leonard explained as we walked through the property during our due diligence inspection, is that you're not trying to control the tenant's business. You're just ensuring they comply with their lease obligations. Very different dynamic than trying to compete with them directly. The building's tenant list included 12 different businesses, including Marlowe and Winslow LLP, which occupied 2 floors under a 5-year lease with renewal options. Trent Marlowe's firm was a model tenant, always paid on time, maintained their space properly, generated no complaints from other tenants. From a landlord's perspective, they were exactly the kind of professional services firm you wanted in your building. But lease agreements are contracts, and contracts have terms that tenants sometimes overlook when business is good and cash flow is steady. Occupancy reporting, requirements, subletting restrictions, insurance compliance obligations, small details that most tenants handle through their office managers without much oversight from the partners. We weren't looking for violations. We were looking for patterns, for a deeper understanding of how successful law firms actually operated when they thought nobody was watching. What we found was that even the most prestigious firms sometimes got sloppy with administrative details when they were focused on billable hours and client development. Marlowe and Winslow had sublet a portion of their second floor to a legal tech startup without properly notifying the landlord or updating their insurance coverage. It wasn't fraud, wasn't even necessarily intentional, just the kind of operational oversight that happens when smart people get busy and assume someone else is handling the details. Under most circumstances, it would have been a non-issue. A phone call, some paperwork, maybe a small administrative fee to update the lease terms. But contracts are leverage, and leverage is only useful if you understand when and how to apply it. Noor spent weeks analyzing Marlowe and Winslow's public filings, cross-referencing court records with bar association databases, building a comprehensive picture of the firm's operational patterns. What emerged was a portrait of a successful but not invulnerable business, dependent on a small number of high-value clients, carrying significant overhead costs, operating with the kind of confidence that comes from never having faced serious adversity. They're not criminals, nor concluded after completing her analysis. They're just people who've been successful long enough to assume the rules don't apply to them in quite the same way they apply to everyone else. That was all we needed to know. We weren't planning to destroy anyone or engage in illegal conduct. We were simply positioning ourselves to understand how the system worked from the inside, to have access to the same kind of information and influence that successful people took for granted. The difference between being a stepping stone and being a player isn't about intelligence or even hard work. It's about understanding that every system has levers, and if you're patient enough to find them, careful enough to use them responsibly, and smart enough to stay within legal boundaries, you can influence outcomes in ways that most people never realize are possible. They say timing is everything, and whoever they are, they're absolutely right. For years to the week after Sienna handed me divorce papers in that law school parking lot, Marlowe and Winslow threw themselves a party that would have made a tech startup's IPO celebration look modest. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, sitting in the cab of a Harbor Line truck at 11:47 p.m., watching my ex-wife's triumph streamed live on a tablet while the rest of Greywater slept. The Riverside Convention Center had been transformed into something that belonged in a private equity firm's annual report. Crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than most people's cars, floral arrangements that looked like they'd been airlifted from some exclusive Upper West Side florist, and enough Dom Perignon to float a small yacht. This wasn't just a celebration, it was a statement, a declaration that Marlowe and Winslow had officially joined the ranks of firms that charge 4 figures an hour and don't apologize for it. The reason for all the success? A verdict in the Meridian Industries toxic waste litigation that had just netted the firm a contingency fee worth somewhere north of $40 million. Not bad for 3 years of work, even by big law standards. And there, standing at the podium in a dress that probably cost more than my first car, was Sienna Vale. Sorry, Sienna Vale Marlowe now, according to the wedding announcement I'd seen in the legal journal 6 months ago. She looked exactly like what she'd always wanted to become. Polished, successful, untouchable. Her hair was different, shorter, more severe, styled like someone who'd stepped off the pages of a Fortune 500 annual report. The nervous energy that used to animate her in law school had been replaced by the kind of confidence that comes from winning cases that make national headlines. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the tablet speakers, "this victory represents more than just a successful outcome for our clients. It demonstrates what's possible when talent, resources, and unwavering commitment converge around a common purpose." Unwavering commitment. That was rich, coming from someone who'd planned her divorce like a corporate merger while I was fixing her brake lights. But I had to admit, she delivered the line with conviction. For years had turned her into exactly the kind of lawyer she dreamed of becoming. Sharp, articulate, and completely convinced of her own narrative. Trent Marlowe stood behind her, beaming like a proud mentor at his protege's moment of triumph. He'd put on some weight since I'd last seen him, the kind of soft prosperity that comes from too many client dinners and not enough time in the gym. But he still had that politician's smile, that ability to make everything sound like destiny rather than calculated ambition. The camera panned across the crowd, partners, associates, clients, and the kind of people who show up to legal industry events because being seen is part of their business model. I recognized a few faces from the financial press, some federal judges, a handful of politicians who probably had Marlowe and Winslow on speed dial when campaign finance law got complicated. What struck me wasn't the success. I'd always known Sienna was brilliant, always known she'd find a way to the top of whatever mountain she decided to climb. What struck me was how completely she'd become the person she'd always intended to be, as if the 3 years we'd spent married had been nothing more than a brief detour on her way to this moment. Diego, sitting in the passenger seat nursing coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, glanced at the tablet and shook his head. "You sure you want to watch this?" "Yeah," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure why. Maybe it was like passing a car accident. You know you shouldn't look, but something primal compels you anyway. Or maybe I needed to see proof that my old life had continued without me, that the world I'd walked away from was still spinning just fine. The speeches continued for another 20 minutes. Partners taking credit, clients expressing gratitude, Trent making jokes that weren't quite funny but drew laughter anyway, because people knew they were supposed to laugh. Standard corporate theater, the kind of performance that happens whenever large amounts of money change hands, and everyone wants to feel good about their role in the process. But while I was watching Sienna accept congratulations and pose for photographs, Noor was doing what she did best, analyzing the subtext, looking for the details that most people missed. She'd been monitoring Marlowe and Winslow's public filings for months, tracking their expansion plans, their new hires, their growing confidence in their own invincibility. Interesting timing for a celebration, she murmured, scrolling through her tablet. Their liability insurance renewal is coming up next month, and their largest corporate client just announced a restructuring that could affect ongoing litigation funding. That was Noor's way. She saw patterns where other people saw isolated events, connections where others saw coincidences. According to her analysis, Marlowe and Winslow was riding high on the Meridian verdict, but they'd also taken on significant overhead expansion based on projected revenue that might not materialize if the legal market shifted. Plus, she continued, they've got partnership decisions coming up in January. 7 associates up for consideration, including your ex-wife. That's a lot of equity dilution for a firm that just committed to some very expensive office improvements. I turned off the tablet and leaned back in the driver's seat, processing what I'd seen and what it meant. For years ago, watching Sienna's success would have felt like salt in an open wound. Tonight, it felt different, like watching a movie about people I'd once known but no longer had any connection to. The next morning, everything changed. Leonard Pembroke called at 7:23 a.m. with news that our building management company had discovered a compliance issue during their quarterly audit. Marlowe and Winslow had indeed sublet portions of their leased space without proper notification, a technical violation of their occupancy reporting requirements that triggered a broader review of their lease compliance. Under normal circumstances, it would have been resolved with a phone call and some paperwork. But these weren't normal circumstances. The building's loan agreement included specific covenants about tenant occupancy and commercial use classifications, and any material change in tenant status required lender notification and approval. It's not a big deal by itself, Leonard explained, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who'd spent decades navigating complex financial arrangements. But it does give Stonebridge North the right to conduct a comprehensive review of tenant compliance. And if other issues come up during that review. He didn't need to finish the sentence. We both understood the implications. A comprehensive review would examine everything: insurance coverage, partnership changes, financial reporting, regulatory compliance. The kind of scrutiny that most successful businesses could survive, but only if they'd been scrupulously careful about dotting every I and crossing every T. At the same time, Geneva Brooks at the State Bar received an anonymous envelope containing copies of public court filings that raised questions about some of Marlowe and Winslow's disclosure practices in recent contingency cases. Nothing criminal, nothing that screamed misconduct, but enough to warrant what she would later describe as preliminary inquiries into potential compliance concerns. The documents were all publicly available: court filings, ethics opinions, partnership agreements that had been submitted as part of various legal proceedings. But assembled together, they painted a picture of a firm that had grown comfortable with cutting corners, of lawyers who'd been successful long enough to assume that success itself was a form of immunity. By noon, Hank Dorsey was loading envelopes into his weathered briefcase, preparing for what would become known in legal circles as the Marlowe and Winslow Day. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because sometimes the most effective pressure comes not from a single catastrophic event, but from the simultaneous convergence of multiple small problems that suddenly aren't small anymore. I spent that afternoon in the Harbor Line warehouse, inventorying equipment and pretending I wasn't thinking about timing, about the strange mathematics of revenge, about how 4 years of patient preparation could converge on a single moment when the universe finally seemed ready to balance its books. The phone started ringing at 4:17 p.m. Unknown numbers, blocked calls, the digital equivalent of panic spreading through fiber optic cables. I let them all go to voicemail and went back to work, because some conversations require the right setting, and a warehouse full of trucks and honest sweat wasn't the place for the kind of discussion that was coming. By sunset, The celebration at the Riverside Convention Center felt like something that had happened in a different lifetime, to different people, in a world where actions didn't have consequences and success was permanent. But I knew better now. I'd learned that every empire is temporary, every victory is conditional. And sometimes the most important moment in your life happens not when you're on stage accepting congratulations, but when you're sitting in a truck cab at midnight, finally understanding what justice actually looks like when it wears work clothes and carries a clipboard. There's something almost poetic about watching a perfectly orchestrated event implode in real time, especially when that event cost more than most people's annual salary and was designed specifically to Project Invincibility. The Meridian Industries victory celebration was supposed to be Marlowe and Winslow's coronation, their public declaration that they'd officially joined the ranks of elite litigation boutiques that charge obscene fees and deliver results that justify every penny. Instead, it became a masterclass in how quickly confidence can turn into damage control when reality comes knocking. I wasn't there, of course. I was 40 miles away in Greywater, sitting in Anchor's diner with Diego and Ox, splitting a pie that tasted like it had been made from ingredients that predated the Clinton administration. But thanks to Cara Lynn's live coverage for Legal Industry Weekly and about a dozen smartphones held by people who suddenly found themselves witnessing history, I had a front-row seat to what would later be called the most spectacular service of process in recent memory. The Riverside Convention Center's grand ballroom had been transformed into something that belonged in a luxury lifestyle magazine. Ice sculptures that probably cost more than my truck payment, floral arrangements that looked like they'd been designed by someone with serious daddy issues, and an unlimited budget, and enough premium alcohol to float a small litigation practice. The kind of party that screams, "We have so much money we don't know what to do with it all," which, in hindsight, probably wasn't the message they wanted to send 12 hours before their world started falling apart. Hank Dorsey entered at exactly 8:47 p.m., according to the timestamp on Cara Lynn's footage. Hank was 63 years old, built like a fire hydrant, and had been serving legal papers for 35 years with the kind of methodical precision that would have impressed a Swiss watchmaker. He didn't look like much: gray suit from Men's Warehouse, sensible shoes, the kind of unremarkable appearance that let him blend into any environment until the moment he needed to be noticed. But Hank had a reputation in the legal community, and that reputation was simple. He never missed, never made mistakes, and never let personal feelings interfere with professional obligations. When Hank Dorsey showed up with his weathered briefcase and his polite smile, it meant someone's day was about to get significantly more complicated. He moved through the crowd like a shark through a school of fish, purposeful but unhurried, drawing no attention until he was exactly where he needed to be. The first target was Marla Quaid, the firm's administrator, who was standing near the bar explaining to a group of clients why Marlowe and Winslow's new office expansion represented strategic positioning for sustained growth in high-value litigation markets. "Excuse me, Ms. Quaid," Hank said, his voice carrying the kind of professional courtesy that immediately made everyone within earshot stop talking. "I have some documents for you." Marla took the envelope with the confused smile of someone who couldn't quite process why legal papers were being served at a celebration dinner. She opened it, read the first paragraph of the tenant audit demand, and her expression shifted from confusion to something approaching panic. The room didn't erupt in chaos. This was a gathering of lawyers, after all, and lawyers are trained to maintain composure even when their world is collapsing around them. But there was a subtle shift in the energy, the kind of change that happens when a group of predators suddenly realizes they might be prey instead. Hank's second stop was Trent Marlowe himself, who was holding court near the dessert station with a group of federal judges and some politicians whose names I recognized from campaign finance disclosure forms. Trent was in full charm mode, telling stories about the Meridian case that made it sound like he'd personally wrestled justice from the jaws of corporate malfeasance. "Mr. Marlowe," Hank interrupted, extending another envelope with the same polite smile. "Bar inquiry notification." The words hit the group like a physical blow. Federal judges don't like being associated with lawyers who are under professional investigation, and politicians get nervous when cameras are rolling and ethics questions are being raised. Within 30 seconds, Trent found himself standing alone except for Hank, who waited patiently, while the senior partner processed the implications of what he was holding. But Hank wasn't finished. His third and final stop was the person I'd really come to see. Sienna, who was posing for photographs with some clients near the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city's skyline. She looked radiant in that particular way that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be, doing exactly what you're meant to do. Ms. Vale Marlowe, Hank said, and even through the tablet screen, I could see her stiffen at the sound of her married name being spoken with such formal precision. Additional compliance documentation requires your immediate attention. The envelope he handed her was thicker than the others, weighted with the kind of legal paperwork that represents weeks of preparation and months of accumulated consequences. When she opened it and began reading, the transformation was immediate and complete. Confidence replaced by comprehension, triumph replaced by the kind of focused intensity that lawyers develop when they realize they're no longer advocate but defendant. Cara Lynn's camera caught it all. The moment recognition dawned on Sienna's face, the way Trent's campaign smile finally cracked, the gradual exodus of guests who suddenly remembered they had urgent business elsewhere. Not dramatic, not explosive, just the quiet implosion that happens when carefully constructed facades finally meet immovable reality. The most telling detail wasn't the panic or the whispered conversations or the way people started checking their phones for exit strategies. It was the silence, the absence of the confident laughter that had filled the room just minutes earlier, replaced by the kind of hushed tones that lawyers use when they're calculating liability exposure and wondering how badly they've miscalculated. By 9:15 p.m., the Riverside Convention Center's grand ballroom looked like the site of a very expensive crime scene. Crystal glasses abandoned half full on tables, floral arrangements wilting under lights that suddenly seemed too bright, and the kind of scattered paperwork that indicated people had left quickly without worrying about appearances. Back at Anchor's Diner, I turned off the tablet and focused on my coffee, which had gone cold but still tasted better than anything I'd consumed during my marriage to the woman I'd just watched receive the kind of legal papers that turn celebrations into crisis management sessions. Feel better now? Diego asked, cutting another slice of pie with the kind of precision he'd once used to disarm IEDs in Fallujah. Honestly, I thought about that for a moment, searching for something approaching satisfaction or vindication. I feel like I just watched someone get exactly what they ordered, delivered exactly when they expected it, prepared exactly according to their specifications. Ox, who'd been quietly working his way through a stack of pancakes that could have fed a small Marine unit, looked up with the kind of philosophical expression that comes from 30 years of moving heavy objects for people who couldn't move them themselves. Karma's a funny thing, he said, syrup dripping from his fork. Sometimes it takes its sweet time getting to your address, but it never forgets where you live. My phone buzzed, the first of what would eventually become 420 missed calls, all from the same number, all from the same person who'd handed me divorce papers 4 years ago, and was now discovering that some signatures have longer consequences than others. I let it ring and ordered another slice of pie, because some conversations require the right setting, and a diner that serves honest food to honest people seemed like exactly the right place to wait for justice to finish making its rounds. There's something almost hypnotic about watching your phone light up with the same number over and over again, like a digital SOS from someone who's finally figured out that the ship they built their life on has more holes than hull. By day 3, the missed calls had reached 420, a number that felt significant in some cosmic way, as if the universe had a sense of humor about mathematical symmetry and poetic justice. Sienna Vale Marlowe. The name appeared on my screen with the persistence of someone who'd spent her entire adult life believing that determination and intelligence could solve any problem, override any obstacle, negotiate any outcome. For 4 years, that phone number had been dead to me, a digital ghost from a life I'd deliberately erased. Now it was the only number calling, sometimes every 10 minutes, sometimes in clusters of 5 or 6 attempts, like someone frantically knocking on a door they weren't sure still led anywhere. I let every single call go to voicemail. The messages started cool and professional, the tone of someone conducting business with a party they assumed would be reasonable once they understood the situation. Grant, this is Sienna. I need to speak with you about some legal matters that have come up. Please call me back when you get this. Legal matters. as if what was happening to Marlowe and Winslow was some kind of natural disaster, an act of God that required crisis management rather than consequence management. By the second day, the tone shifted to something approaching urgency. Grant, I know you're getting these messages. The firm is dealing with some compliance issues that apparently involve properties you're connected to. We need to discuss how to resolve this situation professionally. Professionally. That was rich, coming from someone who'd planned our divorce like a corporate merger while I was fixing her car and sleeping in the same bed, completely oblivious to the hostile takeover happening in my own marriage. The third day brought desperation disguised as legal reasoning. Grant, whatever you think this accomplishes, it's not going to work the way you imagine. The Bar Association takes these kinds of complaints seriously, and if there's evidence of coordinated harassment or abusive process, that creates liability for everyone involved. Harassment, abusive process, the kind of legal terminology that lawyers deploy when they're losing an argument and need to make their opponent sound unreasonable. But here's what Sienna had never understood about me. I wasn't trying to win an argument. I was just letting gravity do its work. The messages got longer, more detailed, more revealing with each iteration. She talked about partnership decisions that were being delayed, about clients who were asking uncomfortable questions, about insurance renewals that were suddenly more complicated than expected. She mentioned Trent's blood pressure medication, the stress eating that had him going through a bottle of Macallan 25 every 3 days, the way partners were looking at each other across conference room tables like they were calculating who would get thrown overboard first. What struck me wasn't the panic. I'd expected that. What struck me was how completely she'd become the person she'd always intended to be, even in crisis. Every message was strategically crafted, every word chosen for maximum persuasive impact. She was still trying to manage me, still assuming that if she could just find the right combination of reasoning and emotional appeal, I'd fall back into my old role as the reasonable guy who fixed problems without asking uncomfortable questions. By message 37, she'd moved into what I recognized as her closing argument mode, the voice she probably used with juries when she needed them to see past the evidence to the human story underneath. Grant, I know I hurt you. I know the way things ended was clinical, but this isn't just about me. There are associates at this firm who had nothing to do with our relationship, people who are looking at losing their careers because of decisions I made 4 years ago. Associates. Junior lawyers who were probably drowning in student debt, working 100-hour weeks, hoping to make partner in a firm that might not exist long enough to honor those promises. She was right. They were innocent bystanders in a conflict they hadn't created and couldn't control. But innocence is a luxury I'd lost 4 years ago in a law school parking lot. And sympathy is a resource I'd exhausted during 3 years of marriage to someone who'd already checked out emotionally while I was still trying to figure out how to make us work. Message 63 revealed the depth of the problem. The building management company is demanding a comprehensive audit of all tenant improvements and modifications going back 5 years. They're claiming that our subletting arrangement with Tech Legal Solutions violated occupancy classifications and insurance requirements. The loan acceleration clause means we have 30 days to cure all compliance defects or face immediate foreclosure proceedings. Tech Legal Solutions, the AI-powered legal research startup that had been subletting space from Marlowe and Winslow to prototype some machine learning algorithms for contract analysis. Cutting-edge technology, venture capital funding, the kind of innovation that made law firms feel modern and relevant. Also, apparently, the kind of arrangement that created technical lease violations when the paperwork wasn't handled with sufficient attention to detail. Message 89 brought the first admission of something approaching vulnerability. I've been married to Trent for 6 months, and I'm watching him fall apart in ways I didn't know were possible. He built this firm from nothing, Grant. He's poured 30 years of his life into making it something that mattered. Whatever you want from me, whatever closure you need, can we please find a way to discuss it that doesn't destroy everything he's worked for? Trent Marlowe, falling apart. The man who'd called me a stepping stone was apparently discovering that foundations can be more fragile than they appear, that success built on shortcuts and casual ethical flexibility doesn't weather storms, as well as success built on sustainable practices and genuine competence. But it was message 127 that finally got my attention, not because of what she said, but because of what she didn't say. Her voice was different, smaller, more human, stripped of the professional polish that had defined every interaction we'd had during the last year of our marriage. Grant, I dream about that day in the parking lot sometimes. I dream about what would have happened if I'd asked you to fight for us instead of just handling the situation efficiently. I wake up wondering if you ever think about that, if there was some version of that conversation where we found a way to stay in the same story. The same story, as if our marriage had been a narrative she could edit, revise, restructure until it served her purposes better. But some stories don't have happy endings, and some characters are designed to be written out when they stop serving the plot. Message 200 brought legal threats disguised as professional consultation. I've been advised that coordinated efforts to damage a business through technical compliance violations could constitute tortious interference with contractual relations. I don't want to believe you'd engage in that kind of conduct, but I need to understand what's happening here. Tortious interference, the kind of cause of action that lawyers threaten when they're running out of better options. But here's what 4 years of building a legitimate business had taught me. When you operate within legal boundaries, when you document everything, when you work with lawyers and accountants and insurance companies to make sure your activities are transparent and defensible, threats become just noise. By message 300, she'd moved past threats to something approaching negotiation. What do you want, Grant? Seriously, what would it take for you to call off whatever this is? Money? Public acknowledgement of some kind? Changes in how the firm operates? I can't fix what happened between us, but maybe I can fix what's happening now. What did I want? That was the question I'd been asking myself for 4 years, the question that had driven me to disappear, to rebuild, to position myself where I could finally answer it honestly. Message 420 came at 3:17 a.m. on a Thursday, and it was different from all the others. No legal reasoning, no strategic positioning, no appeals to sympathy or logic. Just exhaustion and something that might have been genuine regret. I used to think intelligence was the same thing as wisdom, that if I was smart enough I could optimize my way to happiness. But intelligence without integrity is just sophisticated self-deception, and I've been deceiving myself about a lot of things for a very long time. I don't know if you'll ever listen to these messages, but if you do, I'm sorry. Not because of what's happening to the firm, but because of what I did to us. Because you deserved better than someone who treated love like a business problem that needed to be solved efficiently. I saved that message and deleted all the others. Then I called Diego and told him it was time to set up a meeting, because some conversations can only happen face-to-face, in a place that remembers who you used to be before you became who you needed to become. Rex Daly slid me the key to the back booth at Anchor's Diner without a word. Just the kind of knowing nod that passes between men who understand that some conversations require privacy and bulletproof coffee. The booth was tucked behind a pillar that had been supporting the building since Eisenhower was president, far enough from the main dining area that you could discuss sensitive matters without worrying about eavesdroppers or smartphone cameras. I'd chosen Anchor's deliberately, not because it was convenient, but because it was honest. Vinyl seats patched with duct tape, fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly jaundiced, coffee that could strip paint but somehow tasted like integrity. The kind of place where working people came to eat real food for reasonable prices, where nobody wore $1,000 suits or talked about portfolio diversification strategies over artisanal pastries. Sienna arrived at exactly 2 p.m., flanked by Trent Marlowe and someone I didn't recognize, a junior partner, probably, brought along to take notes and witness whatever settlement negotiations they imagined were about to take place. The contrast was immediately apparent. 3 people who looked like they'd stepped out of a corporate law firm's recruiting brochure, sitting in a diner that served truckers and dock workers, and people who understood the difference between earning money and making it. Sienna looked older, not in a way that suggested decline, but in a way that suggested experience. 4 years of high-stakes litigation had carved lines around her eyes that hadn't been there when we were married, added a gravity to her expression that came from winning cases worth tens of millions of dollars. She was still beautiful, still carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd never met a problem she couldn't solve through careful analysis and strategic thinking. But there was something different too, something I couldn't quite identify until she sat down across from me, and I realized what it was. She looked tired. Not physically exhausted, but spiritually depleted, like someone who'd achieved everything she'd ever wanted only to discover that achievement and satisfaction weren't the same thing. Trent, on the other hand, looked like hell. The smooth confidence I remembered from that holiday party had been replaced by the kind of stress that shows up in bloodshot eyes and trembling hands. His Tom Ford suit couldn't hide the weight he'd lost, and the expensive watch on his wrist seemed to be ticking too loudly, marking time he couldn't afford to waste. "Grant," Sienna said, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone conducting a deposition. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us." I nodded, but didn't respond immediately. Part of me wanted to savor this moment. The sight of three lawyers sitting in a truck stop diner, forced to negotiate on my terms and my territory with my rules. But revenge fantasies are like junk food. They taste good in small doses, but leave you feeling sick if you consume too much. "Before we start," I said, gesturing toward Diego, who sat beside me with the relaxed alertness of someone who'd learned to stay calm in much more dangerous situations, "I want to be clear about something. You're not my enemies. You're a lesson I finished learning 4 years ago." Trent started to speak, probably some prepared statement about mutual interests and reasonable solutions, but I held up a hand to stop him. "I'm going to give you choices," I continued. "3 specific options that will resolve the compliance issues with Stonebridge North and address the Bar Association's concerns about disclosure practices. You can accept them, reject them, or try to negotiate modifications. But understand that these aren't opening positions in some complex litigation strategy. They're the terms." I pulled out a folder, nothing fancy, just a manila file folder from the office supply store, and placed it on the table between us. Inside were documents that Anika Desai had prepared with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that would have impressed a Fortune 500 compliance team. "First," I said, opening to the first tab, "Stonebridge North will restructure the building debt to allow Marlowe and Winslow a clean exit from their current lease obligations. But only if the firm surrenders 2 floors to a nonprofit tenant, Echo Harbor Justice Center, under a 15-year lease with fixed rent increases tied to the Consumer Price Index." Sienna frowned as she read the terms. "A veterans legal clinic? That's specific." "Colonel Miriam Duarte runs it," Diego explained. "She provides legal services to veterans and low-income clients who can't afford the kind of representation that charges $800 an hour." Trent's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching outrage. "You're asking us to subsidize our competition? I'm asking you to remember that the legal system is supposed to serve everyone, not just people who can afford premium rates," I replied. "Consider it community service." The second tab contained documentation that would have made any compliance officer nervous. "The firm will also publish corrections to 3 public filings where time records didn't match court documentation, and return a portion of fees on the Hartwell Industries matter where billing discrepancies suggest creative interpretations of billable hour calculations." That got their attention. The Hartwell case had been settled 2 years ago, but if the state bar decided to investigate billing practices, it could trigger audits of other contingency cases, potentially affecting the firm's malpractice insurance and bar standing. "This isn't an admission of fraud," I continued before anyone could object. "It's an admission that your time tracking systems weren't as accurate as they should have been. Honest mistakes, corrected voluntarily." The third tab was the one I'd been most careful about, the condition that would determine whether this was about justice or just elaborate revenge. Finally, Sienna, not Trent, not the firm's general counsel, but Sienna personally, will sign the new compliance policy governing all future disclosure requirements and ethical obligations. Sienna looked up from the documents, and for the first time since she'd walked into the diner, I saw something in her expression that reminded me of the woman I'd married. Not the polished attorney or the ambitious associate, but the person who'd once cared about doing the right thing even when it was inconvenient. "Why me specifically?" she asked. "Because you're the one with the most to lose and the most to gain," I said. "If you sign it, you own it. Every disclosure requirement, every ethical obligation, every compliance standard becomes your personal responsibility. If the firm cuts corners or plays games with bar requirements, your name is on the policy that was supposed to prevent it." Trent was shaking his head before I finished speaking. "That's unreasonable. No partner would accept that kind of personal liability." "Then don't," I said simply. "Walk away from the table." Find another solution to your compliance problems, another way to handle the bar association's concerns, another building to house your practice. The silence stretched for nearly a minute, broken only by the sound of Rex refilling coffee cups at other tables and the distant hum of traffic on Harbor Street. I could see the calculations happening behind 3 pairs of eyes: risk assessment, liability analysis, the kind of cost-benefit evaluation that lawyers do instinctively when faced with unpleasant choices. Finally, Sienna spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "Why are you doing this, Grant? Really, not the legal justification or the business rationale. Why?" I thought about that question, about the 4 years I'd spent building something legitimate and sustainable, about the difference between revenge and accountability, about the Marines I'd served with who deserved legal representation they could afford. "Because somebody did it for me once," I said. "They pulled me out of a hole without asking what shovel I used to dig it." That wasn't entirely true. I'd pulled myself out, with help from people like Diego and Tasha and Mr. Leong, who'd given me chances without expecting anything in return. But it was true enough, true in the way that mattered for this conversation. Sienna looked at Trent, then at the junior partner, then back at the documents spread across the diner table. When she finally spoke, it was with the voice of someone who'd spent 4 years learning the difference between being smart and being wise. "I'll need to review the compliance policy language with our insurance carrier," she said. "And we'll need guarantees that resolving these issues closes any ongoing bar association inquiries." "Agreed," I said. "But you have 48 hours to decide. After that, Stonebridge North exercises its right to accelerate the building loan, and the State Bar receives additional documentation that might broaden their investigation." As they gathered their papers and prepared to leave, Sienna lingered for a moment, looking like she wanted to say something personal, something that went beyond legal negotiations and compliance requirements. "Thank you," she said finally, "for not destroying me when you probably could have." I didn't respond, because some statements don't require answers, and some forms of gratitude are their own kind of justice. I watched them walk to their car, probably a Tesla or BMW, something that projected success and confidence even when the people driving it were running out of both. Then I ordered another cup of coffee and sat in that booth for another hour, thinking about choices and consequences, about the difference between winning and being right, about what justice looks like when it's wearing work clothes and sitting in a diner that serves honest food to honest people. Pride, it turns out, is expensive as hell, and payroll is due every Friday whether your ego can afford it or not. Marlowe and Winslow took the deal, not because they wanted to, not because they thought it was fair, but because the alternative was watching 30 years of legal practice disappear into bankruptcy proceedings and bar disciplinary actions. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is swallow your pride before it chokes you to death. The paperwork took 6 weeks to finalize, processed through the kind of legal machinery that turns handshake agreements into binding contracts with enough subclauses to choke a small law library. Anika Desai handled our end with the methodical precision of someone who'd learned that details matter more than dramatics, while Marlowe and Winslow's attorneys, different attorneys, brought in specifically for damage control, negotiated language that would let their clients save face while accepting terms that fundamentally restructured their business model. Echo Harbor Justice Center moved into the building on the first Monday in April, when the spring light was finally strong enough to burn off the harbor fog and make everything look possible again. We didn't cut a ribbon because nobody had thought to buy one, and besides, the ceremony felt more honest with just coffee, donuts from Murphy's Bakery, and a line of clients that stretched around the block, veterans dealing with disability claims, immigrant families navigating citizenship paperwork, small business owners who needed contract advice but couldn't afford boutique hourly rates. Colonel Miriam Duarte stood in the lobby that morning, surveying the organized chaos of people helping people, and smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd spent 30 years in military logistics and knew the difference between mission planning and mission accomplished. She'd transformed 2 floors of premium office space into something that actually served the community. Intake desks staffed by bilingual paralegals, conference rooms equipped with technology that worked instead of impressing, a waiting area with comfortable chairs and magazines that weren't 3 years old. "You know what I like about this setup?" she told me as we watched a young associate explain VA benefits to a Marine who'd been fighting the system for 2 years. No marble floors, no crystal chandeliers, no artwork that costs more than someone's annual salary. Just good people doing necessary work for fair compensation. Fair compensation. That was the key phrase in the compliance agreement Sienna had signed. Echo Harbor couldn't match the partnership track salaries that big law associates expected, but they offered something increasingly rare in the legal profession: the chance to practice law in service of people who actually needed legal services, rather than corporations looking for creative ways to minimize tax obligations or regulatory compliance. Harborline Rig and Recovery signed the logistics contract that same week, 10 years guaranteed, renewable based on performance, with built-in expansion clauses as Echo Harbor grew to serve additional communities. We'd be handling everything from records management to equipment installation, not just for the Justice Center, but for a network of affiliated clinics that Colonel Duarte was planning to establish throughout the region. The contract represented more than just revenue. It was validation that we'd built something sustainable, something that could weather economic downturns and market fluctuations because it served essential functions rather than luxury preferences. Within 6 months, we'd added 6 more trucks to handle the increased volume, then 9 more when the referral network expanded to include legal aid societies in 3 neighboring states. Diego promoted Eli Novak to operations manager, a decision that proved smarter than anyone expected when Eli designed an inventory tracking system that reduced equipment loss by 40% while improving client satisfaction scores. Boone, Ox, Turner became our senior trainer, teaching new drivers the difference between moving someone's possessions and handling legal materials that might determine whether families stayed together or businesses survived regulatory challenges. The work was good work, honest, necessary, profitable enough to provide decent wages and health insurance, meaningful enough that people looked forward to Monday mornings instead of dreading them. We still operated without flashy marketing or Silicon Valley growth metrics, but our reputation spread through the professional networks that actually mattered. Lawyers who needed reliable service, nonprofits that required cost-effective logistics, government agencies that valued contractors who showed up on time and didn't overcharge for basic competence. Mr. Leong started coming by the warehouse on Saturday mornings, bringing steamed buns and calling our crew my noisy sons, which was probably the closest thing to a family blessing I'd received since my father died. He'd sit in the break room, drinking tea from a thermos that had been with him longer than some of our employees had been alive, listening to Diego and Ox argue about sports while Eli explained his latest efficiency improvements to anyone who'd listen. Those Saturday mornings became something I looked forward to more than I'd expected. The casual camaraderie of people who'd chosen each other rather than being assigned to work together, the satisfaction of building something that employed good people doing necessary work, the quiet pride that comes from creating value rather than just extracting it from someone else's efforts. I never went back to Columbia Law School, never drove past the parking lot where Sienna had handed me divorce papers, and started the sequence of events that led to everything that followed. I didn't need to measure distance traveled by returning to starting points. I could see how far I'd come by looking at what we'd built, at the people whose lives were better because we'd chosen to do difficult work competently rather than easy work carelessly. Sometimes, late at night when the warehouse was quiet and the harbor was still, I'd scroll through old voicemails just to remember what my own silence had sounded like during those months when I'd thought disappearing was the same thing as solving problems. There's a difference between running away and strategic withdrawal, between giving up and regrouping, between being defeated and choosing your battles more carefully. The message from Sienna came on a Tuesday evening in October, 6 months after Echo Harbor had opened, 3 months after Marlowe and Winslow had quietly settled the last of their bar association compliance issues. Not a phone call this time, just a text message that probably took her 20 minutes to compose and edit. "Thank you for not destroying me." I read it twice, saved it, then deleted it, because some communications are meant to be acknowledged rather than preserved. She was right. I could have destroyed her, could have used the information Nor had gathered to turn regulatory inquiries into criminal investigations, could have made sure that her legal career ended as abruptly as our marriage had. But destruction is easy, and any idiot with enough anger and patience can tear things down. Building something worth preserving, that takes different skills, different priorities, different definitions of success. I'd learned the difference between justice and revenge, between accountability and cruelty, between giving people what they deserve and giving them what they need to become better versions of themselves. People say revenge is sweet, but I think peace is quieter. It doesn't announce itself with explosions or dramatic confrontations. It just settles over your life like calm water after a storm, steady and sustainable and deeper than whatever came before. The sun was setting behind the harbor cranes when I went back to work, back to the honest satisfaction of fixing things that were broken, moving things that needed to be moved, building something that would still matter long after the people who dismissed me as a stepping stone had forgotten my name entirely. That was enough. More than enough, actually. It was everything I'd never known I wanted, achieved through means I'd never imagined I possessed, in partnership with people who'd proven that loyalty and competence matter more than credentials and connections. Some stories end with vindication, others with victory, but the best ones end with work, meaningful work, done well, in service of something larger than personal grievances or professional ambitions. We went back to work, all of us, because that's what you do when you've finally found your place in the world and discovered that it fits exactly as well as you'd hoped it would.